Hello, and welcome to episode 529 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Paridon, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And with me, as always, no longer jet lagged, is my co host, author, and historian, John Parshall. How are you this October the 21st?
I'm doing well. I'm feeling distinctly better than I was last week, I gotta say. So yeah, happy to be here. In the middle of grinding away on the book. Just got done laying out the September chapter.
You're almost there.
Almost there, baby. Yeah.
3 more months.
Yeah, something like well, yeah, but then got to do all the copy editing and all that happy crap. But anyway, yeah, getting there. It's
Fun,
big.
fun, 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 fun.
Yep.
All right. So I don't have my normal pithy intro to this week's
Yeah.
episode because this is your bag. This is exactly the first chapter, well, part of the first chapter of your book,
Yeah.
upcoming book. And just to give the brief context into what we're looking at here, we've gone through the Pearl Harbor operation ad nauseum,
Hmm.
episode after episode after episode, which I think were good. But Pearl Harbor is connected to other things, and this is one of
Yes.
those other things. And this is the kickstart of the massive Japanese operation to seize resources. So let's get after
Yep.
it. This is the preparation for the invasion of Malaya.
Right.
So
Right.
let's get after it, John. What's going on here?
Yeah, so I think what we want to cover here basically are two things. First of all, to put the overall Japanese plan for the capture of all of Southeast Asia into some sort of a context, and then to kind of lay the groundwork for what's going to happen during the Malayan campaign. And I don't know what the deal is as an American, why I'm so enthralled with the Malayan campaign, but I just think it's an absolutely fascinating 100 days or so. And I guess that dates back to one of the earliest books that I read in this field, which was H.P. Wilmot's Empires in the Balance, which is still just brilliant. And his coverage of this particular campaign likewise remains absolutely brilliant. So, for me, it just sort of exerts this constant attraction because it's such an epic disaster for the British Empire, and it
Yeah, it
really,
is.
oh my God, and it really does paint. Just it colors everything about the first 6 months of the year 1942. Malaya has this enormous ripple impact on a number of other areas that we'll get into. But yeah, it's just a spectacular campaign.
So,
So yeah, go
oh,
ahead.
no, I was going to say, I'll act as interviewer, if you will, for this. And
Yeah,
I was going to ask you, or state this. We've always said throughout the Pearl Harbor stuff and the lead up to Pearl Harbor that for the most part, it wasn't a year-long planning. They hadn't been planning this for years or
right.
none of this malarkey. It was okay, here's the opportunity. Let's do it now or soon.
Yeah.
And this is very, very much like that. But there's several things that influence this decision for the Japanese.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that was sort of the common mythos when I was growing up as a kid.
Hmm.
You'd read, like the Time Life series books and other things
Yep.
like that, and they would portray the reason for Japanese success in the early part of the war in places like the Philippines and Malaya was because they had been meticulously planning these campaigns for decades in advance. And it's like, that's all baloney. It really isn't until the fall of France in June of 1940, May, June, that some of the lower level Japanese divisional staffs in China start mulling on the notion of, what would happen if we were given the green light to go ahead and seize the Dutch East Indies? How would we actually go about doing that? But it's not until the summer of 1941, so we're talking 5 months before the war actually starts, that with the oil embargo
Hmm.
now imposed on the Japanese as a result of their moves into Indochina,
Indochina. Yep.
all of a sudden, both naval and army GHQ are just like, whoa,
Yeah.
we may be in a war. What are we going to do here? And that just kind of kicks things into high gear. But the final shape of this operational plan is not going to be even agreed upon until 29 October 1941. Think about that,
Goodness. Yeah.
right? So, that's less than a month before Nagumo is going to be sailing for Pearl Harbor. And some of the generals who are going to be very prominent in this campaign, guys like Yamashita Tomoyuki, who is the head of 25th Army, who's going to capture Singapore, that dude doesn't even take over that army. He's given orders on 5 November
Mhm.
to come in and take that thing over.
A month
A
before.
month, yeah, before the balloon is going to go up. So this is very much a pickup affair. You know, we're going to be in a war. We got to figure out what we're going to do.
Let me ask you this. You said that not until the fall of France does this really start to, does that seed, start to germinate here in the minds. Is it because of the no, not Japanese, I'm sorry. Is it because of the British now full commitment to the war in Europe? And it's like maybe they may be distracted over here and now would be the time, or soon would be the
Absolutely,
time. Yeah.
absolutely. And one of the things I talk about in my book is that in a real sense, you can almost blame the fall of France on as being responsible for why Malaya ends up going down too,
Hmm.
because with France going to pieces, that means that the French Navy now is out of the picture, and it had
Right.
always been the French Navy that was the counterweight to the Italian Navy. And now, if you're the Royal Navy, you've suddenly got this whole new set of problems that I've got to figure out some way to keep Malta in supply. I've got to keep the supply lines open to the rest of the Middle East, and who is going to, contest the Italian fleet, which is quite powerful in the Mediterranean? It's got to be us.
Hmm.
Crap, you know,
Right.
because that then ties into the whole notion of what Singapore was in the interwar years as far as the British were concerned. That the strategy had always been that if the Japanese get uppity, we're going to bring over a major portion of the Royal Navy's battle fleet and main fleet to Singapore. That was this slogan that was sort of ballyhooed for 20 odd years. We're going to move this big old fleet over to Singapore, and that will deter the Japanese. Now, all of a sudden, the Royal Navy, as the middle of 1940 and 41 wind on,
Can't do that.
realize we ain't got the assets. We can't do it.
Yeah.
And that throws everything into confusion.
Yeah.
So,
And we'll get into that here in just a few minutes when we start to talk about
right.
the beginnings of what is going to be Force Z, but there's a
Yeah.
lot that goes into that too. So what exactly are the Japanese plans for the area? Not for Malaya. We'll get to the
Right.
exact plans for the Malaya operation in just a bit, but
Yeah.
why the hell are they going here in the first place?
We're going here because it's got raw materials, primarily oil. So if you look at sort of the blow by blow of what is located in this neck of the woods, and they've got, first of all, oil is at the top of the list, particularly at Palembang, which is in Sumatra, really big
Mhm.
field there. But there are also significant deposits to be found elsewhere in Indonesia, also in Borneo, and also in Burma, the yin and yang oil fields there. So there's a lot of oil in this neck of the woods. And having been put under an oil embargo, the clock is ticking. The
You gotta have
Navy's
oil.
got to have oil, or our fleet is useless, and they know they've only got about 2 years worth of stockpiles. Beyond that, there's bauxite for aluminum for aircraft. That's absolutely essential. There's rubber, there's coal, cobalt, copper, graphite, iron ore, lead, and nickel. And you need all of those things if you're going to have a modern military. And so, if they can't trade anymore to get that stuff, they're going to have to go and seize it. And so that's the main intention. We're going to take what they call the Southern Resource Area, and we're going to grab all this stuff.
So you put in here 38% of the world's rubber production
Is
comes
in
from
Malaya.
Malaya,
Yeah.
and 58% of the tin
Yes.
also comes from Malaya as well. So I mean, these are
Yeah.
not, resource poor regions by
No.
any stretch of the mind.
Right. And there's a lot of extractive capacity built into these colonies. I mean, if you're a country like Britain, your whole model is you're not going to build refining or manufacturing capabilities in your colonies. You're going to extract resources
Sure.
from the colonies. You're going to bring them back to the home island. You're going to produce there. But the Japanese likewise know that, okay, well, there at least are really big tin mines and really big rubber plantations here that if we go and grab, we're going to be able to bring this stuff back to our home islands. So that's what they're going to do. The other thing from a geographic standpoint is that if you look at a map of the world, you can kind of see that the western coast of Malaya, and I should try to do it in mirror image, forms kind of the western bastion of this barrier. It's called the Malay Barrier. You know, it sweeps down through this curve of islands, through Sumatra, then Indonesia, Bali, through Timor, and then on into New Guinea. And you can look at that as being sort of the western and southern bulwark of what this new empire is going to look like. We got to grab all of this territory and fortify it, and that will make it very difficult for the Allies to then launch counterattacks back against us and take these new gotten gains away from us. So the game plan is we're going to go and grab this stuff, and we're going to do it real fast.
Yeah.
That's the other part of this operational plan that is important, is just this frenetically high operational tempo, because they understand that they're going to be outnumbered when they come into this thing. They figure that there's about 380,000 Allied troops in this neck of the woods, and they can only bring maybe 300,000 troops total to the party. And they understand, too, that if they give the British in particular time to land more reinforcements in places like Malaya, that those campaigns could potentially bog down, and they don't get what they want as quickly as they want.
So let me get you to clarify real quick. You said
Yeah,
300,000. That's not for Malaya. That's for the whole enchilada.
the whole shooting match.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
They're going to capture this whole neck of the woods, this enormous empire, and they're going to do it
Yeah.
with about 11 divisions. That's the game plan.
Okay.
And yeah, so op tempo is really important. Malaya Malaya is important in its own right, but it really is only a stepping stone to Sumatra and
Right.
Indonesia. That's really the end goal here. We got to get the oil. And so to that end, we cannot leave Singapore at the very tip of the Malayan Peninsula unreduced, because
It's
it's
a
like
thorn.
it's a dagger at everything. From if you've got a big fleet at Singapore, you can reinforce the Philippines, you can contest any naval moves against Indonesia. It guards Britain's most important colony, which is India. So yes, Singapore's got to go, and it is, if you will, sort of it's the lock for this whole Malayan barrier thing. We got to unlock that. We got to have the key to that neck of the woods, and that is Singapore.
Which is precisely why this is not the only goal of this entire Japanese operation. You mentioned Philippines, and we'll talk about the Philippines extensively in episodes in the future, the
Yeah.
fall of. But that's also part of this plan, and in Pearl Harbor is all part of this. And we
Yep.
talked about that previous, but it's good to talk about it again briefly, and that this is all one big
Big thing.
ball. This is not, individual. I mean, they are individual operations, but they all support one another or to some degree, right?
Yep, that's right. Pearl Harbor can be seen as tactically offensive, but operationally defensive, in that Pearl Harbor is trying to do is knock out the American battle fleet, such that that battle fleet will not be in a position to launch counterattacks through the Central Pacific, which might, go into the flank and the rear of this general southern advance. So um, it's felt to be very important by the Imperial Navy that Pearl Harbor work, because they're actually putting the majority of their surface units down into the southern offensive. If Pearl Harbor fails, crap, now we got to pivot. We got to bring more of these assets back to the Central Pacific to, shore
Yeah.
up our position there, which means that the tempo of our operations to the south may be degraded, which then would allow the Brits to bring in more reinforcements and potentially their own fleet. So Pearl Harbor is important, but it really is defensive in orientation, in that it's designed to shore up the eastern flank of this new empire that they're getting for themselves.
So you put in the notes here, each move south is designed to extend the ground-based air.
Right.
And to a degree, I found that fascinating when I read your comments on here, is that this is not unlike what MacArthur does in New Guinea Yeah, it's the same
Same thing.
damn thing. It's the
Same
exact
damn
same
thing.
thing.
Absolutely. Because one of the advantages the Japanese know that they have in this campaign is they figure there's about 700 Allied aircraft in the theater. They're going to bring about 1,100 machines to the party. And they have confidence that their machines are quite good and that their pilots, a lot of these cats, both Army and Navy, have experience in China too. So the basic game plan is if you look at the series of operations that wind down heading south towards Indonesia, time after time, what they'll do is the Japanese will land an amphibious party, a brigade or a regiment or a battalion in some cases. They're going to grab the local airfield. They bring in base personnel and engineers. They refurb that airfield and put it back into operation, sometimes overnight. And then they fly in a new group of aircraft that then will extend the air envelope down over where they're going to go grab next. And so it's just leapfrog, 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 down towards the south. And that air envelope is consistently advancing towards the south, towards the ultimate objective, which is Java.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
All right. So we mentioned Singapore.
Yeah.
I mean, Singapore was a bastion of British defense in the region for a long damn time.
A long damn time. And
Let's talk about it.
unfortunately, yeah, a lot of it is kind of unfortunately sort of mythical because
Hmm.
it had been ballyhooed as the Gibraltar of the Pacific, and it really was a big fleet base, but it wasn't as big as it could have been, and that has to do with British interwar defense spending policy. Um, so there, and I'm sort of skipping ahead here. During the interwar period, starting in 1922 from 1932, there was this thing known as the 10-year rule
Hmm.
that said that, okay, British military, you will be basing your plans and estimates on the assumption that the country will not be involved in a major war anytime in the next 10 years. And fascinatingly, the dude that puts this rule in place is none other than the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Winston Churchill. So he is the author of this rule. And so in 1924, for instance, when Singapore is being built out as this big fleet base, it is Churchill who, says things like, "There's not the slightest chance of a war with Japan in our lifetime," and he actually scales back not only the size of the naval base at Seletar on Singapore, but also, some of any notion of creating landward defenses on the island of Singapore itself. So if you look at British defense spending, for instance, in 1919, so the very end of World War I, British defense spending was about 766 million pounds. By the
Hmm.
time that 10-year rule goes into place, by the time you fast forward to 1932, that defense spending is now down to 102 million pounds. So,
Yeah.
almost just about an eighth of what it had been. And it's only in 1932 that this rule is finally abandoned because they're starting to get, premonitions of there's this dude named Hitler in Germany. We may have a problem here. But that 10-year rule is going to lead to Britain being in a, oh my God, we're in catch up territory all during the late 1930s, and Germany being ahead of them because of that rule. Anyway, so the whole notion, though, had been that, as I said, if the balloon goes up, we're going to move this big British fleet over to
Right.
Singapore, and we're going to do our thing there. Um, but yeah, the bottom line is that Singapore itself is really not a major bastion in any sense of the word. It's just a big empty fleet base with pretty paltry defenses on the northern shore of the island.
We'll get to the King's troops here in just a minute because they're not what you would imagine them to be for
Right,
something that the British felt was so important.
right.
But I want to get back to the to Churchill very briefly, and
Yeah,
that and I like Winston Churchill just as much as anybody else. He was a brilliant guy, really, in a lot of ways, but
complex,
yeah,
but
very much so.
mhm,
But Yeah, I mean, I put this in the notes and, we kind of bantered about a little bit. I mean, he is really partially to, well, not partially, he's a big part of the blame as to why Malaya is the way it is in
Absolutely.
1941.
Yep.
Because even as you say, the balloon goes up in 1939
Yeah.
and Churchill comes into, he's the head banana and still he's holding back assets. And I understand it to a degree because he's trying to make sure the Krauts don't land in, Suffolk,
Right.
So I mean, I get
Yeah.
it, but it's
Yeah.
he's shoulders a lot of blame here.
Absolutely. And this is a point I meant to bring the book up from the basement. The Defense and Fall of Singapore by Brian Farrell is one of my favorite books on this topic, and also H.P. Wilmot's book. But yeah, we have a tendency when we look at this campaign that we're going to look at some of the British officers that are within
Mhm.
Malaya itself, and those are all going to be the fall guys, right? They're all the easy
Sure.
scapegoats, and we'll talk about them in a little bit. But yeah, it is absolutely clear that there was an air of unreality within London and Whitehall around what is it going to take to actually defend Malaya and what kind of opposition are we up against in the Japanese. There's just they just don't understand what's going on in that respect. And so, yeah, a lot of the problems with the defense of Malaya and Singapore really could be laid at the feet of those in London during the interwar years, and Churchill is absolutely on that list.
Yeah. And we talked about it briefly, but let's kind of dig into it a little bit more here. You said, in the event that things go south, the
Yep,
British plan was to send the fleet or a portion thereof
yep.
to Singapore to do multiple
Deter the
things.
jet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
wait, show the flag, saber rattling, whatever you want to call it,
Hmm.
and then eventually get, boots on the ground, more boots on the ground, and we'll get to that here in a bit too.
Right.
But Churchill, right before everything goes down, he does decide almost last minute to send some ships out there. And of course, this is 4C. This is Prince of Wales and
Yeah.
the old gal Repulse.
Yeah.
But he receives a lot of flack, if you will, from Admiralty because Admiralty there's like, no, we don't
No.
think this is a good idea.
No. Basically, the Admiralty is coming back to Churchill, and they're like, "Look, if you're serious about deterring the Japanese, you really need to send a proper battle fleet out there."
Right.
And that means we need multiple capital ships, preferably some aircraft carriers, and this needs to be organized and supplied and actually done the right way. And Winston is like, no, speed is more important than I haven't got time to wait around for you guys to be able to send 5 or 6 battleships out there. I've got to get something out there right now, a flying squadron in the parlance, and this is more of a morale boosting notion really than anything else. But he does hope that if I send a modern fast battleship in the form of the Prince of
Prince of
Wales,
Wales.
along with Repulse, that no modern fast battleship has ever been sunk by an airplane before, and this is a very a frontline combatant, that this should properly cow the Japanese into thinking twice about whether or not they actually want to tangle with what is the largest colonial empire in the world. And that's another thing that we sort of lose sight of, again, with 80 years hindsight. And this is something that Alan Allport points out in his book Britain at Bay, is that it's difficult to remember now just what an enormous and seemingly eternal presence the British Empire was
Yeah.
in 1941. They command enormous swaths of territory. They have 500 million people,
Hmm.
under their flag. They have ruled the waves effortlessly,
Yeah.
for hundreds and hundreds of years at this point. And so, you don't want to tangle with the British casually. And it again, it's hard to think about that now,
Sure.
in these day and age. But messing with the British Empire is a big deal, And so, and the coin of the realm for them has always been their navy. So if we send out 2 of our capital ships here to Singapore, we're painting a very clear picture for you. You do not want to mess with us. Because yeah, we have a tendency to lose the first couple battles, but we always win the war, old boy.
Hmm.
So anyway,
Yeah. Yeah.
That's kind of what's going down there with sending Force Z out
I I
to
found it
Singapore.
interesting, but not again, as I put in the notes, not surprising, is that, he does choose to send battleships out there. And, I guess Repulse could be classified as a battle cruiser, but regardless of this,
Yeah,
it's a big gunship.
big gunship.
And he sends those two vessels out there as opposed to aircraft carriers.
Right.
And I mean, that goes into, and again, we talked about this, we beat that horse to death when we talk about Pearl Harbor, is that, the Allies did not know the Japanese capability. And certainly not the United States Navy. And I venture to say the Royal Navy didn't either, in
Yeah.
terms of, that surface vessels, while they do kind of rule the day in the Atlantic Ocean, they don't, at least yet, in the Pacific. And this is something that understandably they didn't understand yet, but they're going
Yeah.
to learn quick, fast, in a hurry here.
We're losing. Yeah, there's going to be some hard lessons here. And there's some new scholarship that's come out in the last 5 to 7 years. It had always been supposed that the carrier Indomitable was supposed to
Mhm.
be part of Force Z, and actually it never was. That
Mhm.
there's some new discoveries that have been made on that Indomitable was not considered part of that task force initially, and then when she grounds herself in Jamaica on 2 November, she's clearly not going to be up to getting out to Singapore in time to show the flag. But yeah, this was purely a surface force effort on the part of Churchill in terms of bucking it up.
Do we know the date? And if I saw it, I missed it, that he gives the order to send those out there?
I can find that.
It's
It's
no big deal.
sometime in
I was just curious.
it's October, I believe, with
Okay.
war clouds darkening,
Gotcha. Yeah.
that the decision is made to send those out. So
And they get
anyway,
out there on the 2nd of December, and we can talk
2nd
about,
of
well,
December. Yeah,
yeah,
we'll
we'll do
have a whole
4C
episode
another
on
day.
the
Yeah.
sinking of 4C because that's just really, really interesting. So anyway, what ends up happening then in the late 1930s, as it becomes apparent that the this whole notion of main fleet to Singapore really isn't going to work.
Mhm.
Now the Brits are left scrambling. Well, how are we going to defend Malaya in the event of a war with the Japanese? And the answer that gets proposed is, well, we're going to use the Royal Air Force. That the best way to prevent an invasion is to sink that enemy invasion fleet while it's still out at sea. Fair enough. And so they decide what they're going to do is they're going to build 10 airfields along the length and breadth of the Malayan Peninsula, and we're going to beef those up with aircraft. And initially, the Royal Air Force asks for 336 modern aircraft to be based out there. And then they up that estimate eventually to 582 aircraft, which is a lot of planes.
A lot of airplanes.
Yeah. Unfortunately, of course, they ain't got those many airplanes to spare, not when you're in the middle of the Battle of Britain and other things like that. So that creates numerous problems because they've built all these air bases in Malaya. They haven't got enough airplanes to put on those air bases, but those air bases are still need to be defended by Army
Right.
ground troops. And the site of all of those air bases has not been selected on the basis of defensibility from a ground standpoint. In fact, the Royal Air Force didn't even consult with the British Army at all about where are we going to put these damned air bases. They just built them where they wanted and then sort of just presented a fait accompli to the British Army. Here are our air bases, please defend them. So
Right.
that's not so cool. So eventually, what ends up happening on the very eve of war is it becomes apparent that actually the defense of Malaya is going to have to be done old school with ground troops. And H.P. Wilmot has this blistering critique of this whole thing. He says, for the defense of Malaya, the British had placed their faith in warships. When they realized the bankruptcy of this notion, they turned to air power in order to economize on troops. And in the end, they sent troops to economize on aircraft.
Mhm.
Right. So
Yeah.
that's the situation on the eve of war is that we're going to have to defend this place using bayonets and bullets.
I'd be interested and I know that information's out there and we'd have to dig, but in terms of these aircraft that are out there, and I know you put down, it's like Brewster Buffaloes and
Right.
Blenheims and Hudsons and Vickers
Yep.
Wildebeest, all these, kind of antiquated airplanes in
Hot
1941,
trash.
42.
Yeah.
But the logistic support for these airfields, the mechs, the ground crews that are out
Yep.
there, exactly what was their situation? Were they even able to keep these damn things in the air with any
Yeah.
kind of reliability? And it harkens back to the Philippines. And obviously we have a large army in the Philippines, including majority of which are Filipinos. But a
Yeah.
lot of the defensive capability in the Philippines, of course, is going to be air power as well. And we can, that's
Yes.
a whole
Your,
shenanigans, but
your,
similar
your
here.
Your question is right on the money. And just going back to the comments of our friend Justin Pike, he's like, Air Forces do not just, spring into being because they have airplanes. There are
Right.
all these soft factors, which you allude to, that how many spare parts have we got in
Yeah.
Malaya? Have we got enough avgas? Have we got good repair facilities? Are there spare
Hmm.
tires for these damn
Yeah.
things? What's the status of the airfield themselves? And in general, the airfields were pretty good quality. But yeah, there's all these soft factors at work, and a lot of them do not play out well for the British because the RAF is scrimping on things out here in the boonies because they just don't think the Japanese are a first-rate opponent. So famously, the commander in the area, the overall commander, is a guy named Brooke-Popham. We're going to talk about him in a little bit. And he's like, Brewster Buffaloes are fine for this neck of the woods. We should leave the Spitfires back in Britain where they can be useful. And because
I
that gives you,
kind of understand, considering.
right, right. So, yeah, the result is that what's out here in Malaya is 4 squadrons of Buffaloes, 4 squadrons of British Blenheims, which are just, I'm sorry, they're garbage. Two of Lockheed Hudson's, likewise garbage, and 2 squadrons of Vickers Wildebeest biplane torpedo aircraft, which are garbage.
Mhm.
So, against that, the Japanese are bringing in both Army and Navy units, although there are no zeros here in theater. And this is another sort of persistent myth of that this is where the Zero fighter makes its debut
Mhm.
and
China.
new. This is mostly an Army game, an Imperial Army aviation campaign, and they are bringing a mixture of Key 43 Oscars and Key 27 Nates. And the
Mhm.
Nate is, we talked about this again with Justin when he was here with us. The Nate is just as old an airframe as the Buffalo is, and yet turns out that the Japanese use those Nates a lot more competently than the Brits use their Buffaloes, and that says a lot about just the overall quality of the Imperial Army's air forces and also their ground organizations, that they know what they're doing and they can get a lot out of these airframes.
I mean, I think a lot of that also is going to point back to China. I mean, these guys,
They've
a,
flown in China.
a great majority of these Japanese pilots that are going to see action here have been flying in China for year, 2 years,
Couple of
3 years,
years. Yep.
whatever the case may be. And these Brits and other colonials that are going to be flying these aircraft maybe have a little combat in Europe, maybe, but highly
Not
unlikely.
likely.
Yeah.
Right. That's exactly right.
Okay. So
So
it's
then,
not shaping up to be a good show in the air.
no, it's not shaping up to be a good show on the air. And then that brings us to what's going on in the ground, and there's a real mismatch there as well. Um, Here again, Churchill's influence rears its ugly head. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about 1942, just in general, is that there's a lot of interconnections between the various theaters of the war. And that's one of the things I try to point out, that it's hard to understand this year unless you look at the totality of what's happening theater wise. So one of these interconnection points is what's going on in the Middle East
Mm.
as how it pertains to what's happening in Malaya. So Churchill makes the decision that he is going to try to prop up the Greek government and sends a number of reinforcements out of the Middle East Command up to Greece, where, of course, they're going to end up getting shellacked, when the Germans do invade Greece and then subsequently invade Crete. There's a case to be made that, those same troops, if they had been left in the hands of O'Connor and then subsequently Auchinleck, they might have been able to kick the Italians completely out of that theater had not those troops been squandered in the Greek fiasco. And likewise, the losses that the British are going to sustain in the Greek campaign directly degrades their ability to then laterally reinforce Malaya when things go south there. So, just bear that all in mind as well, that there were troops that could potentially have been in Malaya that instead were squandered in places like Greece.
Churchill had this fascination with the Med, and in particular Greece,
Yeah,
all the way through 1944, when
right.
he was, heckling, not King, Marshall
Churchill.
and FDR
Yep.
and Leahy
Yeah.
to launch a massive amphibious operation in Greece. And
Yes.
and the Americans are sitting there going, why?
Yeah, dude.
No, let
Yeah.
it go. And it took like months to
Oh, yeah.
convince him that this is not a good idea and we ain't doing it. But
Right.
he had
Right
this
away.
fascination with that area.
Well,
Anyway,
and he had, he was a human whirlwind. He's an idea hamster. He's just constantly churning out, you
idea.
know,
I like that.
every day, there's 150 million memos going out from this dude. And that was actually one of the things that his main general, Alan Brooke, has just that's half of his damn job is just curtailing Churchill and reading through the memos and picking out the 1 out of 10 that actually makes sense.
Mm,
But to your point, Churchill was also fascinated, much like Hitler, with Norway. Churchill wanted to invade Norway any number of
mm,
times. So he's got this real thing for peripheral, what we as Americans would view as peripheral theaters, because the British are short on manpower. They know that. And thus they're always looking at ways to kind of peck around the perimeter and weaken the Germans because they don't actually want to fight the Germans toe to toe in Northern Europe. This is a real point of contention in early 1942 between the Brits and the Americans when we're trying to come up with joint strategy. The American strategy, as I put in my book, is about as direct as a broadsword through the chest. You put a massive army into Northern Europe, you drive through the industrial heart of the Ruhr, you rip it out, and you crush the Reich. That's how we're going to win this war. And the Brits are like, oh, no, 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 no. We're not going to do that. So anyway, sorry, I'm tanking
it's
on,
okay. No, it's
but
fine.
yeah,
It's
that's
fine, but
just
because it all plays a part into all of this. I mean, not
yeah,
obviously not invasion of Europe, but I mean the whole
right.
obsession with these, fringe operations on either side is
Sorry for the
is
phone.
is a is what's that?
Oh, the phone is ringing in the
Oh,
background, and
it's a snafu. It throws a wrench into the plans of otherwise
yes,
important operations, of which this is one. So
right. Okay,
let's talk about the poor saps,
the
which
poor
is what they
saps
are,
around.
that are
Oh my
on
God,
Malaya or soon will be.
right. So the total garrison, the British garrison in Malaya at this point consists of about 20,000 British troops, 15,000 Australians,
Mm,
37,000 Indian troops, and 17,000 Malay. And so the order of battle is roughly this. You've got the ninth and 11th Indian divisions are in country, and those are really going to be the bulk of the ground forces that are going to feature early on in this battle. Ninth Division has only got two of its three brigades there. 11th has got all three. And then there's the Australian 8th Division, which only has two of its three brigades. And the Aussies is just a whole thing unto itself. And maybe just touch on that. Um, the Australians, of course, were counting on this whole main fleet to Singapore thing going down. But during the late 1930s, they began figuring out on their own dime that there's no way the British are going to be able to do this. And so
right.
you find this quote in the official Australian histories by Wigmore. He's that the attitude in the Australian army towards British thinking regarding moving the fleet to Singapore was, quote, we do not doubt that you are sincere in your beliefs, but frankly, we do not think you will be able to do it. So, so what ends up happening then in Australia, again, as a result of the fall of France, the Australians have already got the 6th and the 7th Division formed or forming.
Mm,
And then they get enough volunteers as a result of the fall of France to constitute a brand new division, the 8th Division. And then the Brits then turn around and ask Australia, we need more ground troops for Malaya. Would you be willing to kick in a division? And they do. But what ends up happening is that division, only two of its three brigades end up in Malaya. The other brigade is going to be split up into penny packets and is going to be on the islands of Timor and Ambon, and also will end up in Rabaul, and we'll talk about that early in the war. So anyway, they got 2/3 of the division sitting in Malaya at this point. There's a lot of problems with the British and the Indian troops that are here. The
Yeah,
Indian,
that's what I was going to ask you.
yeah,
Let's dish on that.
yeah,
So the Brits, the British troops specifically, they have no, well, we'll get to the leadership in a bit, but they really don't have any they're not used to the climate. They don't have a whole hell of a lot of training. And the same
yeah.
could be said for most of the people there, with the exception of the Aussies.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So the Indian Army is expanding tremendously because as the war goes on, the British are like, we're short of manpower. Where are there a lot of people in our empire? Oh, would you look at India? Of course,
Right.
India's got its own complications, obviously, because you've got cats like Nehru and Gandhi who are like, why aren't we independent? And why are we fighting this war on your behalf?
Mhm.
Winston. And there's going to be problems with that throughout 1942. In any case, you've got an Indian army that has been primarily tasked with doing policing and peacekeeping kind of missions, border actions, if you will, within India, are now trying to be turned into a force that is going to
Combat
be
troops. Yeah.
combat troops. That's right. And they're not ready for it. And in many cases, they have not done any sort of large unit training at anything above the battalion level. And the Indian Army is also kind of weird in that any typical Indian Army brigade is going to have two Indian battalions, and then a white battalion will be thrown in there as well.
Mhm.
And of course, all the officers, regardless of whether it's an Indian or a white battalion, are likewise going to be white British officers.
Sure.
But there's some real questions around just how hard are some of these Indian troops going to want to fight in
Right.
you know
In
in
defense of
defense of
something that's not theirs.
not theirs. Yeah, this ain't
Yeah.
my colony. Why am I
Mhm.
here? And so uh, the bottom line is that they're short on training. They haven't got as many heavy weapons as a standard British infantry unit would have. They got a ton of trucks and stuff, but they're also kind of tied to the roads, and they don't like the jungle. They feel that the jungle is just this sort of inimical, hostile presence. They don't like being in the jungle.
Mhm.
So the British Indian Army tends to be very road bound. And only the two brigades from the Aussies and also the 12th Indian Brigade, which is sort of you can think of it as the core reserve, I guess, for Malaya Command. Those units have actually done some jungle training and are pretty good in the jungle. But the rest of the Indian Army and other units that are there are not good in this environment at all.
So we talked about the Indian troops. They're going to be the bulk of the defense.
Yeah.
What do the Japanese think of the Allied forces that are in Malaya right now?
They hold them in utter contempt,
Mhm.
particularly the Indians. They just think the notion of any Asian people being able to stand up to their troops is just laughable to them. And they don't view, the white troops with much more respect. So, for instance, they refer to the Australians as a collection of unemployed people, villains, and so on, who,
Jesus.
who are, quote, known for their lack of military discipline and morals. The bulk of the enemy in Malaya were, quote, of mixed race, have no esprit de corps, and are weak and frail. If one good blow is directed to the center of command and the main white fighting units, the rest will automatically crumble. So,
Not far off.
not far off. Yeah, that's the thing that ends up playing out that's really interesting here. Um, and maybe we can just touch on briefly, part of the reason for that contempt is that some of the troops that they are bringing to this fight are very old, experienced divisions, so
Top
the
notch. Yeah.
top notch. So there's going to be three divisions involved in the Malayan campaign, but the two ringers are 5th and 18th. The third one is the Imperial Guards Division. Imperial Guards is pretty green. They haven't had a lot of combat, but 5th and 18th have been in China for a long time. 5th Division was the first division in the Imperial Army ever to do an amphibious invasion, like back in World War One,
Mm.
is or maybe even earlier than that. They have a long-standing tradition of we do amphibious stuff. 18th Division, likewise, has been fighting in China for a long time. They were involved in the Nanking Massacre.
Mm.
So these dudes they are
Hardcore. Yeah.
hardcore. Yeah. Interestingly, too, both of these divisions, 5th and 18th, are old style square divisions. So they've got two brigades apiece that each have two regiments in them. And so 5th is going to field all four of its regiments in this campaign. 18th Division, we haven't, maybe we'll flash up a map from Senshi Sosho that shows sort
Hmm.
of the spaghetti monster, troop dispositions of the Imperial Army. But one of the features of this whole campaign in Southeast Asia is that the Japanese are not running complete divisions. They're peeling off pieces and parts of their divisions and using them as detachments to land and grab various things. And so, for instance,
Right.
18th Division, its 35th Brigade, they're going to detach its headquarters and then the 124th Infantry Regiment, and they're going to form the Kawaguchi Detachment with our
Mm.
old buddy Kawaguchi Kiyotake, who's going to show up on Guadalcanal in about 8 months. Kawaguchi and his regiment are going to be in charge of grabbing Borneo. That's going to be their task. And so, yeah, there's all these little, independent units that are running around doing other things. But in Malaya, 18th Division is only going to deploy three of its four regiments. In any case, yeah, these guys are highly experienced and kind of badasses, frankly. I mean,
Yeah.
they know what they are doing, and they're up against troops that just have nowhere near the same level of combat experience.
Who's leading all these poor guys here in Malaya for the Allied side?
The
The,
Allied
the head
side,
banana is Robert Brooke-Popham. Who the
yep,
hell is he?
Robert Brooke-Popham is a very experienced RAF officer. He was kind of a dashing, daring do sort of pilot during World War One. He won a lot of honors during that time, but during the mid 1930s, he was kind of getting up there, and so he ends up retiring from the RAF and he becomes the Governor General of Kenya, and that's where he is for a couple of years. Then the war starts. He goes back into service again and ends up eventually coming into command of Far East Command, which is Malaya, Singapore, Burma, and Borneo too, the British chunk in Borneo. So that's his bailiwick, and he's gonna be in charge of that. By the time you get to 1941, this dude is definitely past his prime. He's older, and uh, you know, judging from his remarks that the Brewster Buffalo should be perfectly serviceable here, against the
He's
Japanese,
in the dark.
he's in the dark. He doesn't know what he's up against. And the other weird thing about him is that it's not really about him, it's just about the command arrangements. Yes, he is technically commander in chief of this area, but the Royal Navy does not answer to him. None of their units will talk to this guy. And likewise, all of the civil servants in the various colonies, they don't report to this dude either. They are reporting back to their ministries back in London.
Mm.
So Brooke-Popham's tangible ability to actually order people to do things for him
Yeah.
is limited, and he's not that strong a personality in any case.
Unity of command is not a strong suit in this
No.
operation, as we're
Yeah,
going to see. So,
yeah,
the guy that you most associate with the fall of Malaya and Singapore
yeah.
is Percival.
Our buddy Arthur Percival.
Yeah.
Percival is an interesting cat. Percival came to soldiering very late in life. He was a pretty mediocre school student. He ended up going to work after his graduation. He's working as a clerk in an iron ore company.
Hmm.
And on the very first day of World War One, he volunteers at age 26. And goes in. He's promoted to second lieutenant. He's captain by November of 1914, and by the end of the war, he's won a Croix de Guerre and a military cross, and he's a battalion commander. So, he's
Experienced, yeah.
yeah, he apparently has some aptitude for this, and he's going to be a staff officer throughout the interwar period. And crucially, um, he has the patronage of oh geez, I'm spacing his name now. John Dill, Sir John Dill, who is going to eventually be the head of the British Chiefs of Staff. Dill, during the war, is going to end up in Washington, D.C., being the head of the mission there. He's actually going to be good buddies with George Marshall. Anyway, so Dill is kind of looking over the career of this guy, Percival. Percival goes over to Ireland, and he's involved in the troubles over there, and the Irish hate him because he's nasty. I mean, he tortures
Yeah.
people. He's a bad dude, and to the point that the IRA puts £1,000 reward on his head for anybody that can kill this guy.
Mhm.
So then he shows up in Malaya, and he is going to be appointed. He's a staff officer in Malaya. And in 1937, he actually produces an appreciation paper that points out the fact that the Japanese could come in and burgle Singapore by the back door, that if they invade in Malaya and drive down, we haven't got a lot of defenses there to do anything. So,
Mhm.
he's kind of on the money there. And then he is appointed GOC Malaya in April of 1941 and comes back to the country to take it over. He does not get along with a lot of his subordinates,
Right.
particularly Lewis Heath, who's the commander of 3 Indian Corps, which has got these 2 Indian divisions underneath. He doesn't get along with him. Doesn't get along with,
As you say, they despised each
yeah, they
other.
despise each other. They just can't stand each other. Um, Nor does he get along with the commander of 8th AIF Division, which is Gordon Bennett. Gordon Bennett doesn't get along with anybody, so that's not a surprise. But the bottom line is that there's not a lot of cohesion here. And Percival, he's a staff officer. He's really not what you would call a leader of men.
Combat leader. Yeah.
And I hate to say it, but some of this is due to his rather uninspiring physical presence. He's tall, he's gangly, he's buck-toothed, he's got, a world-class receding chin. He's just this is not you're right. He's just not the kind of cat who walks into a room and people gravitate towards. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, he is going to be the guy who is going to be in charge of this thing in terms of the ground troops here.
We'll talk about Gordon Bennett, who is up there, in my opinion,
Yeah,
with one Douglas MacArthur in terms of
yeah.
ego, in terms of, delusions of grandeur, as I put in the notes.
Hmm.
And while Doug did not have a cowardly streak at all,
Right.
this dude,
Yeah.
he kind of
We'll
has got
we'll
a
talk
yellow
about that
streak.
because
We'll talk
yeah,
about him
there's
later.
some
Yeah.
interesting stuff. So
Yeah.
then on the Japanese side, there's a really interesting series of kind of human subtext to this story. So the top
Yeah.
banana for 25th
Yamashita.
Army is Yamashita, and everybody's heard about this guy, the Tiger of Malaya, and he is, I mean, arguably, he's the best general that the Japanese field from an offensive standpoint in this war. I would
Yeah,
say
I would
he's up
agree.
there. Um, Yamashita is a doctor's son from the Sticks in Shikoku Island, which is the smallest of the 4 home islands. But he graduates 16th out of a class of 920 officers in his 1905 class of the academy. So he is a very bright dude. He's an expert on Germany. He had been a military attaché in Germany from 1919 to 1922. Unfortunately, what ends up happening is he gets involved in the Army's internal factional politics during the 1920s and 30s. And there's this famous incident, the February 26th incident, which is a military coup that happens in 1936. That Hirohito, in one of his few instances of sort of direct intervention, Hirohito gets up in people's grills and is like, "You're going to crush this coup, you know, get on it." And He gets very angry with the people in the faction, the Imperial Way faction, the Kodo Ha faction that are behind this coup, to the point that when the coup is ended, people like Yamashita, who had been sort of passively supporting the coup, get you know get sidelined. In some cases, their careers get ruined. In Yamashita's case, he kind of ends up being sent out to the boonies for a number of years. So Yamashita hates Tojo,
Mhm.
and
And Jojo likewise.
and Tojo likewise does not like Yamashita. And not only that, but other people in Yamashita's army, including General Nishimura, who is the commander of the Imperial Guards unit, which is now on his roster, they hate each other. And most importantly, his operations officer, Suji, who we've talked about before. So you got Suji Masanobu, who is,
Guy's such a tool, man.
oh my God, just such an awful human being, just a terrible person. This is a guy who abandoned his wife and children in Japan so that he could devote himself to, his duties in China. He burns down a geisha house in China with his brother officers still inside it to, protest their moral corruptitude.
Mhm.
Um, he's deeply involved in the failed campaign at Nomonhan, which we
Right.
talked about, and he's just an arrogant, insolent, grating personality. Just can't help but calling everybody else around him stupid. And so he's constantly being kicked from command to command after he wears out his welcome there. One of his brother officers refers to him as a poisonous insect. Um, but because Tojo is his political benefactor, his career consistently gets saved. And
Right.
he ends up being the operations officer for 25th Army, who is in charge of planning this entire campaign. But from Yamashita's standpoint, he looks at Tsuji as basically being Tojo's stool pigeon on
A
his
rat.
staff.
Yeah.
He's a rat. And he is sending reports back to Tojo. And Yamashita kind of knows this, so they can't stand each other. So you got Suji. Suji, though, has been in charge of this operational planning for a lot longer than Yamashita. Like I
Mhm.
say, Yamashita comes in very Johnny come lately in November to take over this army, but by that time the battle plan is already largely in place because of the reconnaissance work that Suji has done in the previous several months. And the result is that 25th Army is basically custom built
Right.
for
Right.
this campaign. So you've got these two really experienced divisions, 5th and 18th. Fifth, in particular, has a lot of motorization. It's the most highly motorized division in the Japanese army. They've got more than 800 trucks, which by Japanese standards is about 4 times as many trucks as a typical division has. By US standards, that's nothing. One of
Right.
our
Yeah.
infantry divisions got like 1,700 trucks, but we're America, right? We got the oil, we got Detroit, we can do that kind of stuff. But
That's right.
the bottom line is that for Japanese formations, they got a lot of motorization. They also introduced this notion famously of using bicycles. So
Hmm.
they're issuing thousands and thousands of bicycles to their infantry regiments. If nothing else, that they can just use these bikes as kind of pack mules. You can put your pack on this damn thing and you can roll it instead of having to, you
Hump
know,
it. Yeah.
hump it, right? So 25th Army is really pretty mobile for a Japanese formation. And not only that, but Suji has very carefully recorded the fact that there are hundreds and hundreds of rivers and creeks and whatnot that we're going to have to bridge. So we've
Hmm.
got tons of bridging material and whatnot, and 3 independent engineering regiments are attached to this army. Likewise, they attached 3 independent tank regiments to this army. And the Brits ain't got no tanks in Malaya. They've got some armored cars, they've got 2-pounder anti tank guns, but they don't have any armor of their own. They've got 3 independent heavy artillery regiments, they've got some 330 millimeter mortar battalions. So, 25th Army is just loaded for bear by Japanese terms. And I really kind of think about it as they're almost the Japanese equivalent of what you might view as a German motorized corps, a Panzer Grenadier kind of outfit that they got a lot of infantry, but they've got armor in here too, and they've got heavy weapons and engine. They got the whole schmear. So they are built to drive down the length of the Malayan Peninsula. It's every bit of 500 miles from where they're going to land down to the Straits of Johor, and they want to get this campaign over with in 100 days or less, meaning we got to advance 5 miles a day. That's a
Moving.
lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And
So
I think the way you put that and the way that Suji built the army, it points to, speed, the
yeah,
need for speed,
the need for speed.
the need to land and just haul ass.
Yep.
Very, as like I put in the notes, very, very, not that I'm a huge fan, but Rommel-esque,
Yeah.
just punch you right through your front teeth and just run and just keep on
Um,
cooking until
yep.
we run into another block and we're going to punch that in the face too. This is
That's
very
exactly right.
similar in that. And I think I put Yamashita as a, because he had studied in Germany.
Yes.
He was a child of the blitzkrieg, if you will,
Yep.
child born of the blitzkrieg, and he knew
Yep.
how
And
to do this.
he had just been out in Germany as an attaché within the last 6 months. And so, by hook or by crook, even though Suji and Yamashita loathe each other, Yamashita is being handed the perfect implement for this campaign, and he's exactly the right kind of general because he is a fire breathing, he's hyper aggressive, and he is a hard driving taskmaster over his divisional commanders. I mean, even when he starts winning his initial victories up north in Malaya, he is just cracking the whips constantly. And his diary is full of these, bitter recriminations about, God, we're not moving fast enough. We're not moving fast enough. His whole notion is what he calls the driving charge. Exactly as you say, what we're going to do with this army is we're going to land on these beaches up around Kota Baru. We're going to drive across the narrow neck of the Kra Isthmus on Malaya, get ourselves onto the main road network in Malaya, which is on the western part of the peninsula, and we are just going to drive like hell down that road down towards Singapore, and as you say, just barrel over anything that gets in
Yeah.
our way. Once we get the British in motion to the rear, we are going to keep them in motion to the rear. And I'm banking on the fact that I've got enough motorization and I've got really experienced, highly physically conditioned troops that we're going to be able to keep up this insane operational tempo. And we're just going to bull rush these guys all the way back to Singapore. That's
Yeah.
the game plan.
The speed, it's blitzkrieg tactics
It's
is what it
blitzkrieg.
is.
You got
It's
it.
a Japanese version of blitzkrieg.
Yep.
You know, Yamashita is going to focus on, as we said, blitzkrieg tactics. But
Mm-hmm.
like any offensive, like any operation anywhere, everything is dictated on the terrain in which you
Yep.
are going to fight.
Right.
And Malaya is not a pancake. It has
No.
some significant terrain
Yeah.
features. Let's
Yeah.
hear about it.
Yeah, so down the middle of this peninsula runs a central line of mountains that in some cases go up to about 7,000 feet. And so there are not a lot of lateral roads running east to west across that mountain range. Really, what you need to do is get onto the western side of the peninsula. That's where the main railroad is and where the main trunk highway is located, and you're gonna go to the south along the west. But the terrain itself is a lot of rainforest, and a lot of rain to that
Mhm.
end. So portions of this country get 260 inches of rainfall a year.
Damn.
So it's wet, soggy. Uh, there's one paved road, but there are a lot of sort of unpaved roads that parallel the main trunk highway, particularly along the coast. There are paths from the locals have made, and there's a railroad here too. So we think of Malaya as being jungle, but it's not jungle in the same way I would argue as something like Guadalcanal or New Guinea,
Mhm.
where there was nothing in terms
Yeah.
of infrastructure. There are,
Impenetrable. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are paved roads here that the British are going to use to good effect. But once you get off of those roads, within a couple hundred yards or whatever, you often then find yourself in really dense country, heavily forested, in many cases, pretty hilly and rugged as well. But again, if there's one thing that the Japanese army can do, it is they can move through rough terrain. They have a very studied indifference to rough
Mhm.
terrain. We can do this stuff. And so there's an irony here in that it's going to be in Malaya that this whole myth of the Japanese soldier as a jungle Superman is going to develop, which is really weird because if you look at Japanese army doctrine at this time, they don't talk about jungle fighting at all.
Mhm.
There's Ed Dre points out that there's like 2 pages in Japan's field manual at this time that talks about jungle combat. This is an army that is configured to fight the Russians on the Mongolian plains. That's what their whole doctrine is built around. But what that means that they're good at is night operations
Yep.
and high tempo of movement. They're a maneuver-based army.
Yep.
They realize that against the Russians that they got to use maneuver to pry people out of positions, hit them with flank attacks, hit them with rear attacks. So they've got really well-conditioned troops that are used to, working at night and feeling their way around enemy flanks and finding weak points and negotiating terrain in order to do that. All of those things that they've built this army to do up in Manchuria pertain to what they're going to find themselves fighting down in Malaya.
Yeah, and when they start hitting those Allied troops and on the Malayan Peninsula and they start rolling through them like that, that
Yep,
causes this massive panic, and
real problems. Yeah, we'll
it's a
talk about
house of
that.
cards. All
Yep,
right, before we close it out, let's look at what are the Japanese plans in terms of landing,
yeah,
and because they do it in three different spots,
yes,
and then moving forward, and then we'll
yeah.
get to the combat next week.
So the basic drill is that the Japanese are going to land on a trio of beaches in the northern part of the country at Singora and Patani, which are in Thailand, not,
Yeah.
which is a neutral country, and then Kota Baru, which is in Malaya proper. So the Japanese are perfectly willing to violate Thai.
They have
We're the
proven this multiple
Japanese.
times.
Yeah, right. We don't care. And actually, the British had an operation called Matador
Matador. Yeah.
waiting in the wings where they recognized that the Japanese might well land at these locations. And so there was a plan in the back pocket to preemptively move British troops up to those two Thai beaches at Singora and Patani. But that would have meant violating Thai sovereignty. And eventually the green light is given, but there's a whole lot of dithering that happens. And so in the end, they don't end up making that move until it's too late.
Too
In
late.
fact, they
Yeah.
just they don't do it. So what ends up happening is, as war clouds are darkening, um, we're getting wind of the fact, and the British are as well, that there are a lot of Japanese transports at sea moving around out there, and the Japanese invasion convoy will be sighted, I believe, on 5 December,
Yep.
and in fact, there's a British Catalina that goes out there to snoop this fleet on the evening of 7 December. It gets shot down. That is arguably the first, fatalities in the broader Pacific War. But yeah, the Japanese will then end up landing on these various beaches about an hour or two before Pearl Harbor goes down. So this is really where the war kicks off, is in Malaya, as the Japanese get themselves onto those beaches, and their first order of business is going to be, as I say, to drive across the Kra Isthmus and come down on the British defenses. And I guess I'll leave you with a quote uh, that was sent a cable from Prime Minister Jan Smuts of South Africa, who is a very experienced soldier himself. And on 18 November, he sends a cable to Winston Churchill and is sort of apprising, Churchill of what he sees as kind of the war situation that is, beginning to develop in the Pacific. And Smuts says, and I quote, "There is here an opening for a first-class disaster." Bum, bum, bum.
Indeed. 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 I mean, it's classified as the greatest British military defeat of all time.
Yeah,
Is what's about to befall
yeah.
the empire here in the next week.
Next week.
But no, I think
Yes,
this is fascinating. I think this is an area, I don't think, I know, this is an area of the war that the vast majority of our audience does not know.
right,
And I get it, more focused on Wake Island and things like that that aired
right,
today. But this is, again, it all plays a part in everything that happens afterwards. This is why we went into all the detail on the lead up to Pearl Harbor. This is no different here.
right.
So
Absolutely.
cool. Anything else we want to talk about?
No, I'm delighted that we've finally been able to get into this. I've been itching to do this for literally years because it's just such an interesting campaign. So yeah, looking forward to getting after it next week and
Oh yeah.
talking some battles, doing some
We're
boom
going
boom.
we will definitely get after it next week.
Yep,
All right. Anything else? You good? You good?
I'm good.
All right, let's wrap it. So with that, we want to
Yep.
thank you very much for listening and or watching to this episode of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Give us a rating and review. We do appreciate it. And today is, what the hell is today? Today is the 21st of October. So we are going to just, when this airs, you'll know we're going to record our Q&A episode 10 days from now on Halloween. So that'll be fun. And we want to personally thank everybody for sending in questions. My buddy Sean got over 500 questions.
We will not be doing all of those.
No, no, we will not. I assure you of that.
Yes.
Sean informed me that he's got enough questions to keep us busy for about 4 or 5 episodes, and which is cool. That's fun.
Yeah, that's great fun.
So we're gonna have some I don't want to call them new guests per se on our Q&A shows, but we're gonna have some returning guests on our Q&A shows that I
Yeah.
think that everybody will enjoy seeing and will enjoy talking with. All right. So once again, my name is Seth Paridon. I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. John, my friend, as always.
Thank you so much for following along with us and our various blatherings. And yeah, I'm John Parshall, and we will see you again next week.